for joining us. I'm Diane Rehm. President Obama asked Congress for formal authorization to fight ISIS. A federal judge orders an Alabama official to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, and NBC suspends anchor Brian Williams without pay for 6 months. Joining me for the domestic hour of the Friday News Roundup, Major Garrett of CBS News, Chris Cillizza of the Washington Post, and Laura Meckler of the Wall Street Journal. I invite you to join us as well. Call us on 800-433-8850. Send us an email to drshow@wamu.org. Follow us on Facebook or Twitter. And welcome to all of you.
Morning,
Good
Diane.
morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. Major Garrett, on Wednesday, President Obama sent the draft authorization request to Congress. Was this a political move or a legal move?
Both, and also a militarily important tactical move in terms of creating a conversation in Congress, and the president and the White House hopes a unified position on how to both create a legal framework and a strategic framework to take on this new threat of terrorism in Iraq and Syria, and wherever ISIS may crop up next. It is a geographically wide open authorization to use military force. So if ISIS or those inspired by ISIS, and that's part of the terminology that has some Democrats a bit nervous, meaning that it could be too broadly defined, but it's largely a reflection of the president's understanding that a new Republican majority has long sought an authorization, a new strategic framework for this new battle. We're not fighting in Afghanistan anymore. The president has carried out the military actions so far under that authorization. He understands, the Congress understands, and I think the country's beginning to understand this is a new battle space, a new enemy, and a new type of approach is required. And if a president's going to do that, the White House has decided, let's bring Congress into the equation, and if possible, and this is the great possibility, insulate this from the coming strife of the 2016 campaign and give all those who seek the nomination for both parties something that's already settled law and settled policy to be revisited when 3 years hence, when a new president and a new Congress can reevaluate what's been achieved or not achieved.
Laura Meckler, how long are they going to debate this?
Well, that you could ask that question about a number of things. I don't think we really know the answer to how long this debate is going to happen. The interesting thing is that you essentially have objections from both Republicans and Democrats in opposing ways. You have Republicans saying that this proposed language boxes this president and future presidents in, it's too restrictive, and you have Democrats saying that it is not restrictive enough and that it has too many loopholes, allows a president to expand. There's a lot of skepticism about obviously past wars and the expansion of military action, wants to bring that in advance. So you essentially have objections from both sides. The president this week was talking about how he was trying to find a middle ground and kind of walk that line. For instance, the language he suggested said that you could not have any enduring offensive ground combat operations. Okay, so that means like you're not going to have another Iraq war. You're not going to have a full-fledged.
The definition of enduring. What about?
Well, in some ways, we're back to depends on what the definition of is. Right. I mean, all these words have the meaning that you bring to it. So enduring offensive, that I think is the concern of Democrats. And Laura mentioned this, and as did Major, and I think it's so important, Diane, is the last time we debated this in 2002, well, debated it briefly last year in 2013 regarding Syria, when it became clear that if the president pushed for a authorization for the use of military force, it would have struggled to pass through Congress, and they wound up finding a different solution. But the last time we debated and passed something like this was in 2002. The political impacts of which that vote continue to be felt. Without Hillary Clinton having supported the authorization for the use of military force, there may have never been in Iraq in 2002, there may have never been a Barack Obama candidacy. We had John Edwards apologizing for his vote. the ghost of that vote looms very largely over this. So I think it's why you see the president saying this is a 3-year timetable. This is not any enduring offensive mission. And I think it's why you see a wariness on the part of many politicians to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to be for this.
So eventually it's going to pass the Congress, Major.
I think it's difficult for me to draft a scenario where Congress, having been brought into this debate and a public clearly focused on this threat of ISIS and all of its various future manifestations, will just punt and say, we can't do this. What there will be, and I think it's helpful for the country, a distillation of what these words mean and a distillation of what our intent is. And one of the objections you hear from Republicans is, let's be a little bit more aggressive in our language about what we intend to do. And there will be a debate about that, and Democrats and Republicans are going to have to get together now. It is squarely in their court. And for all those politicians who said, we really ought to have a voice in this, well, welcome to the show.
So how important, Laurie, is it for President Obama to get out front on this?
Well, I think that it gives him a measure of political cover. If the Congress is on board, then everybody's in this together. If and when there are mistakes that happen, if problems come down the line, it isn't just on him. I think it's also important because in terms of the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branches of government. This is something that's constantly in flux. This is something that President Obama has often tried to kind of have it both ways on this. He has been aggressively used executive power in both the domestic realm and in foreign policy. And he's also talked about wanting to rein it back and not set precedents that we're going to regret in the future. So he's walked a very careful line. We saw that same thing in his proposed language. So I think that having this debate is healthy for the country, because we're essentially, as Major said, we're all going to be talking about what are our goals? What are we getting into? Because I think that there would be few Americans who would be opposed to the idea of trying to combat the Islamic State when you've seen what has happened with these beheadings and everything else.
Can I just add one note of skepticism? And I'm with Major that it's hard for me to conceptualize a scenario under which some AUMF is not agreed to. That said, I interviewed Mac Thornberry. I was surprised with this. I interviewed Mac Thornberry, a Texan who's now the new chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and I asked him basically that question. Look, I understand there's disagreements on the right and the left about language here and what enduring offensive means, et cetera, but at the end of the day, we're going to have some sort of deal and it will pass. And he said, well, I'm not totally sure. Now, part of that may just be the natural legislative tendency to not say, yeah, we will definitely have a deal, because then if there isn't a deal, you say, well, Mac Thornberry, who was the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, said there would be a deal. But I was a little bit taken aback by that, and it just made me think,
it's not
as done a thing as, which, look, if you're looking at Congress in the last few years, you'd be well served to be skeptical about their capacity to do anything, even the things that you assume they should be doing.
Crystal is the Washington Post, Laura Meckler of the Wall Street Journal, Major Garrett of CBS News. The president, Laura, is traveling to Silicon Valley today for a summit on cybersecurity. What's this all about?
Well, there have been so many cyber breaches that have happened to U.S. companies. This is a acute worry. It's also a worry in the sort of national security space. So he's out there trying to find ways to get people to essentially work together better.
To share
information. That's what he's going to be signing an executive order at Stanford today that will make it easier for companies to share classified information among themselves and with the government. So it's a lot of it's voluntary. It's not really clear if it's going to work or how far this will get us down the road. But the idea is just to try to get people working together in a more productive way.
And how are the companies feeling about this, Major?
Well, this builds on a framework executive order the president put forward last year. And what's going to be announced today is that several big companies we're all familiar with, Intel, Apple, Walgreens, AIG, are going to themselves take this framework that the president established and build it into their own systems. So that is a step forward toward taking what the federal government has advised you should have in your own systems, and these companies saying, you know what, we've taken a look at it, we can do it, and we're going to move in that direction. So yes, it's voluntary, but there are some significant commitments from some pretty large players in this realm. It goes without saying that a legislative solution is the ultimate goal here. And the White House and Congress have had some success. The House passed 2 different cybersecurity bills last year. The House Republicans did, with not inconsiderable collaboration and cooperation from the White House. It died in the democratically controlled Senate because of concerns about NSA redrafting of the other part of this equation, which is surveillance and the mechanisms by which the federal government voluntarily, or sometimes without the voluntary consent of companies, gets into their systems to sift data. And Democrats could not resolve those differences because some Democrats did not want to put a cybersecurity bill on the president's desk without resolving the NSA question.
Make sure, Garrett, he's chief White House correspondent for CBS News. He, Chris Alessa, Laura Meckler are here to answer your questions after a short break. To the domestic Friday News Roundup. And if you're just joining us, you can also watch live video streaming. Go to drshow.org.
Just see we are not in our sweatpants.
Exactly. And see all you good folks. Chris Alessa, several Democrats are going to boycott Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's scheduled address to Congress. He will not meet with the president. Even Vice President Biden has said he'll be out of the country. Is there a chance that the prime minister may change his plans?
Well, politics has taught me that there's always a chance. So, sure. I think it's still unlikely. The last I saw, there were 20-ish members who would not attend. And you make the point, Joe Biden will be on a trip abroad. There's 2 things at work here. Well, let me first say, to answer your question, I think it's very likely he still addresses Congress next month. Let me get that out of the way. There's 2 things going on here, Diane. The first is the White House and many Democrats view this as a breach of protocol, which House Speaker John Boehner invited Benjamin Netanyahu to address Congress, did not consult in advance with the White House. This is typically something that is done in conjunction with the White House. Usually the White House makes the offer to speak. The White House made quite clear in the aftermath of the invitation to Netanyahu they were not thrilled about the fact that there was a breach of protocol. So that's part one, and I think some Democrats are not happy with that. Part two is a political consideration, which is the Jewish community in the United States has long been a reliable Democratic voting community and a Democratic donating community as well. There are Democrats who view this as an attempt by Republicans to sort of drive a wedge in that community, saying, "Whoa, Democrats are boycotting a speech by the Prime Minister of Israel. This is an intriguing development." And there are some Jewish Democrats who are boycotting it. So I feel like it's like many things in Washington. It's this fascinating amalgam of politics, policy, personal sort of affronts, all at work together.
And there's policy involved here.
Right.
The speech is about what deal the president and the allied partners, Europe and China and Russia, will or will not strike with Iran over its feared development of a nuclear weapons program. And Netanyahu will come to Congress to take this issue on. Now, there is some political convergence, even among Democrats, skeptical about what this deal is, or at least requiring of the president a submission of that final deal to Congress for approval. And if that ever comes to a vote, it will pass in both chambers. With veto-proof majorities, probably not, but something far closer than the White House would be comfortable with.
Right.
You have a political umbrella over this, and all the politics that Chris mentioned are real, but there's also a significant policy argument that the Prime Minister intends to make.
And it would come 2 weeks before the Israeli election.
Exactly. I mean, that's the other politics here, is Israeli politics. And that's the reason the White House said that they weren't going to meet with the Prime Minister when he's here, is because as a general rule, when a foreign leader is up for re-election, it looks like the United States is putting its sort of hand on the scale if you have a high-level meeting with him. So that's the reason why the President Obama is not meeting with him. It is a pretty extraordinary situation, really. If you stop and think about it, you have the President of the United States trying to negotiate a deal with Iran, which he says is necessary to stop them from developing a nuclear weapon.
Right.
You have skepticism in Congress, which is typical and in some cases quite fierce, and as Major said, majorities in Congress who would pass sanctions that would get in the way of those negotiations. But then you have a foreign leader essentially coming to Washington to give a speech to Congress to oppose what the U.S. president is trying to do. So it's a pretty remarkable situation all around.
And now Reuters is reporting that Netanyahu is weighing giving his speech before AIPAC instead of
Interesting.
the Congress, but an Israeli official told CNN that the speech was still planned at this moment.
So to Laura's point, probably the primary consideration for Benjamin Netanyahu is Benjamin Netanyahu and his electoral future. And so, I think if they are going to find a way out of this, they want to find a way out of it that does not look as though he was bullied not to do it by the American Congress, the American government. They have to find, if he's going to have an exit, maybe it's AIPAC, it has to be in a way that will not make him look weak in some way 2 weeks before an election.
Well, and the former ambassador from Israel to the U.S. has spoken out against the Prime Minister speaking before Congress. I think the whole thing is really,
anything
really
is possible, as Chris
air.
said. The AIPAC speech was going to happen no matter what. There was going to be two speeches. The only question now is, there going to be two or one?
Right.
Okay, number one. And number two, this does speak to something that those within the broadly defined Jewish community and those who look at foreign policy and the history of it are a little bit nervous about, which is anything that breaks the long-standing and hard-won partisan consensus on behalf of standing with Israel, whomever is leading Israel, and under whatever circumstances Israel finds itself in. And any sense that strong bipartisan support is wavering is troubling to those who have fought so long and hard to achieve it.
All right, let's talk about Keystone Pipeline, which the House passed yesterday. Is President Obama going to veto it?
Yes, he is going
yes,
to veto
he
it.
is.
He's going to veto it on this ground. Not that Keystone will never be constructed or he won't ever allow the process of the State Department to reach its fruition, he will say, I'm going to allow precisely that, the process to work itself out. This is not about building it or not building it. It's about expediting the process and short-circuiting this long-running and, from the Republican perspective, slow-walked consideration of this pipeline.
The president says he's continuing to wait for the State Department to come out with its evaluation, but what do you think, Clara?
Well, I think it's been 6+ years. So I think the idea that that really he's going as fast as he possibly can is a little bit hard for people to believe. I mean, there was widespread belief that he punted this till after the 2012 election because he essentially had two important constituency unions and environmentalists at odds over this. Of course, we're well beyond the 2012 election now. And I think that a lot of people, frankly, on both sides, I think would just like to see him make a decision either way. And
if he does veto it, what happens then?
Well, theoretically, we'll go back and they'll see if they can rally a veto in an override of a veto, 2/3 majorities in both House and Senate. I mean, I don't know that you could get 2/3 House majorities in the House and Senate for that. The sky is blue at this point. So, I think it would be difficult to do that. But I think the thing with Keystone, Laura mentioned this, we're 6 years into it. The critical thing to understand with the Keystone decision is he does not have a deadline. There is not a deadline. He does not have to make a decision by fill in the blank day. In theory, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but in theory, he could let it go past his presidency, correct?
Sure.
There does not have to be. He has said he's waiting for the State Department report, but we could get the State Department report and he could say, oh, I want some more information. Anything in Washington that lacks a deadline is the kind of thing that goes on for 6+ years when it seems pretty clear at this point. We know the basic facts on the ground.
I would think that Canada, if indeed the president does veto it, nothing else happens here, Canada will go elsewhere.
Canada will run the pipeline along the border with the United States and run it straight to the Pacific Ocean, which is what they have said is a fallback position, not by any stretch of the imagination, their preferred fallback position. And one thing I would say, two things, quickly on the administration. There have been problems with litigation within the states themselves. Nebraska had a significant disagreement between its governor, its legislature, and state judges there over how to decide what the actual route should be. And that did sort of put everything on hold here in Washington. While. And the other thing I would point out is I've been told that the Canadians in almost every conversation they have with the United States on every other issue inserts Keystone into their list of particulars.
Interesting. All right. Another turn in the same-sex marriage question in Alabama yesterday, Laura. What's the latest?
Well, this is just, the cauldron that has been the debate over same-sex marriage is just, spilling out in Alabama all over the place. You had another federal judge saying that same-sex marriages can proceed. That decision was appealed to the Supreme Court, which allowed it to stand. So that's sort of one interesting thing right there, given the fact that the court is about to consider this matter this spring. And they said, no, Alabama, you can go ahead and proceed with these same-sex marriages. Well, you also have the chief of the state Supreme Court who is saying, no, don't go ahead, stop. So you have these mixed messages to counties and a mishmash of how counties responded. Some of them allowed same-sex marriage licenses to be issued. Others stopped, said, no, we're not going to do that. And others said, we're not going to issue any marriage licenses in the meantime while we try to sort this thing out. So, essentially, we obviously have seen, a huge march in one direction on this issue. We now have same-sex marriages legal in 37 states, which is a pretty remarkable number, given where we were just a few years ago. So, and the Supreme, and we also had Justice Clarence Thomas issuing a biting dissent from this, what is sometimes a routine matter of allowing a lower court ruling to stand, where he said essentially the court is showing its hand, and before we even consider this, is showing that it wants to essentially find a constitutional right to
so is it going to end up in the Supreme Court? And if so, what?
Yeah, I mean, Laura's right. This, I feel like in some ways, this is all precursor to the case this spring. The political fight over gay marriage is effectively over, and I would say that Republicans, if they're being honest and candid with you, would acknowledge that.
Would you agree with that, Major?
Effectively over,
yeah,
in the sense that it is not a part of a political strategy to insert this issue into the political dialogue to gain partisan advantage. By that definition,
which, by the way, is a
effectively
massive, Laura touched on this as well, but is a massive change. Remember that George W. Bush's reelection in 2004 was credited, at least in part, to the turnout among social conservatives due to gay marriage ban initiatives and referenda on the ballot.
And just the
in
fact that
swing
they
states.
all passed. I mean, there were so many on the
That's right.
ballot that year,
Exactly.
just a decade ago. I mean, but I think what we're seeing essentially is polling has moved rapidly. Pollsters say they've never seen an issue move this quickly. Majorities, young people are overwhelmingly in favor of same-sex marriage. You know, for every old person who's an opponent of same-sex marriage who dies is replaced by a baby who will someday support it. I mean, there is just a massive generational switch underway, but there is still almost half of the people who live in this country do oppose it. And many of them live in Alabama. So, you know, essentially even though I think most people think it's headed in the direction towards this is going to be allowed and eventually people will get used to it. That doesn't mean that everyone likes it along the way. And this is going to still a very important issue for some people on the other side.
And what Justice Thomas was referring to is not to have politics so dramatically and visibly stampede or overrun the actual legal process of having the arguments, the consideration of the high court, and resolving what is now a dispute between federal districts on this question. He wants that process, as every Supreme Court justice does, not only to be played itself out, but insulated, or to the greatest degree possible, visibly insulated from this political shift.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Terrible story coming out of North Carolina with 3 Muslim students murdered. Their questions about whether it was a hate crime, Chris.
Right. As of late last night, and I don't believe anything's changed. The reporting out of the state suggested that this was someone who, the shooter, had a obsession, I think is probably not too light a word, with parking issues. That this couple and the sister lived in the same apartment complex with this man. He had confronted them. They had not lived there all that long, but he had confronted them multiple times about parking. They believed, one of them told their father, they believed that it may have had something to do with their religion. Both of the women wore headscarves. In the reporting I saw, they quoted other people who lived in the building who were not Muslim, who said, look, this guy confronted me too about they were parked in a visitor spot and, you know, and I needed to move, which suggests that this may have been the work of someone who was obsessed in a obviously a very unhealthy way with parking as opposed to religion. Right. But anytime you see something like this happen, given the climate that we exist in currently, it's going to be an open question.
More than 5,000 people turned out at the funerals.
Yes. This or memorial service. Yes, it was just a really stirred something. There was the Muslim Lives Matter hashtag trending on Twitter, which obviously is a takeoff on the Black Lives Matter hashtag. That, you know, people this clearly, you know, hit a nerve. I don't know how many of you heard Morning Edition this morning, where the StoryCorps segment was the young woman who had recorded it last year, I think, and she was talking to a teacher of hers, and, you know, sounded like, you know, quite a lovely person.
And talking about how much she loved this country.
Yes, absolutely. So that, I think that certainly brought it home for me.
Exactly.
Hey, look, for the criminal justice system, all lives matter. Justice has to be served. Anyone who's prosecuted a hate crime will tell you it is not always easy from an evidentiary point of view to establish clearly to the persuasive ability of a jury to take on that this was clearly motivated by hate. The sense in the community that this could not simply have been about parking, that you can't imagine. The human mind has a hard time, my human mind has a hard time, conflating anger or resentment over a parking space into a triple homicide of 3 delightful, by every piece of evidence we have, contributing members of their community, peaceable. All of it seems impossible. And yet the prosecutors and the police have to try to solve this in an atmosphere where there has been tremendous sympathy and a rallying of the community, and yet a very deep cry for justice.
Major Garrett, Chris Saleza, Laura Meckler. When we come back, we'll open the phones. We'll talk about the West Coast labor dispute and the loss of several very prominent journalists. Phones for your calls, 800-433-8850. Let's go first to Mike in Bloomington, Illinois. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you. I just had 2 comments on the discussion of ISIL or ISIS.
Sure.
And the first was that I do feel that I lost my train of thought there. Okay, I'll go to the second comment. The second comment was, I think that one of the motivations that Obama might have for going to Congress, you had mentioned that he was going to go to Congress as political cover, but also Walter B. Jones, Congressman Walter Jones, had said that he would initiate impeachment if Obama took any military action without the approval of Congress. So I have to believe that is, a significant motivation for him, and I want to get your reaction to that.
All right, thanks for calling.
I don't think he's afraid of being impeached over this. That I do think, and you've seen this in the quotes and in the wariness from some of the lawmakers, that we are in a little bit of uncharted territory here, in that this has been going on for 6 months under a previous use of force resolution. So it's a little bit of an in medias res type of deal. This is not the president saying, hey, I would like to begin doing this. It's already been happening it's sort of okay, now I recognize that what has existed in the past is not necessarily a perfect and adequate solution. It has not stopped me from doing it, but I would like to adjust it so that everyone feels more comfortable, both Congress and the American public.
Let's go to Dave in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You're on the air.
Hey, Diane.
Hi.
Appreciate your call. Great to call and get through. I wanted to, I guess, address, almost 40 and have had a lot of things go on in my life, but have learned one big thing in relation to communication. And I guess I feel that, as kind of been stated earlier, that our government officials aren't, obviously I feel, communicating, and the information that the communication that needs to take place before they set up meetings by themselves needs to be spoken about, trickle down to the public, and we need to be provided with specifics on the time if we're going to be militarily involved, and the cost. We've already, how many of our generations honestly now are, I believe, going to be paying for what we've hopefully is ended now, but we've continued to move on.
All right, sir. Thanks for your call.
And that's one of the things that I believe will be served by this debate. The country will be brought into the conversation. And as Chris pointed out, this has been going on for 6 months. The White House does have a fallback position here. If Congress can't find a way to reach a meeting of the minds on authorizing the use of military force against ISIS, the president will say, all right, well, I'll still continue to use what we have, which is 2001, which he has argued for the better part of 2.5 years isn't good enough to deal with this particular threat and how it has morphed since 2001. Congress has generally agreed. Now it's going to have to visibly agree.
All right. To Mohammed, he's here in Washington, D.C. You're on the air.
Yes, hi. I just have 2 comments. One, the North Carolina incident, why can't we just call the guy a terrorist instead of finding excuses for mental illness and parking problem? And the second issue is we went to Iraq based on lies from CIA or from whoever it is. We dismantled the countries. We left our weapons there. People are being killed every day in the thousands. And we're sitting here saying, oops, we made a mistake. We're sorry. We don't have anything to do with it.
All right, sir. Thanks for your call. I think your second comment will probably reserve for the second international hour. But on the North Carolina killings and whether this man should be called a terrorist, that's a legal term at this point, is it not? Rather than simply saying, well, he's mentally ill or there was a parking dispute.
I mean, I think I understand his frustration and that it feels like they must have been targeted for who they are. I think that we don't know, and that's frustrating, and that's hard sometimes not to know what exactly was going on. Obviously, it's horrifying regardless of whether it's, whatever it is. When 3 people are gunned down, that is a horrifying situation. I just don't know that if we know enough to know what the guy's motives were. There's a lot of horrible crime that happens in this country every day.
That's for sure. Let's talk about what's happening out there on the West Coast. Operations have been suspended at several West Coast ports. What's happening, Major?
Well, there is a potential of significant damage to this U.S. economy as a result of the slowdown. If it continues to be unresolved, there could be billions of dollars of trickle-down losses in commerce. 12.5% of our country's gross domestic product flows through 36 ports on the west coast of the United States, from Seattle to my hometown of San Diego. These container ships can carry up to 15,000 containers, and they are not being offloaded. Why? Because the companies overseeing this have said, look, there's been a slowdown in operations for the last couple of months. It's a long holiday weekend. That's an overtime period of time. If you're going to slow down before that, we're not going to pay you the overtime because you're slow walking your job now. There's been a lengthy series of negotiations since May of last year over a new contract. The central dispute is not money. Most longshoremen make between $83,000 about $126,000 a year. It's about safety. It's about the dangerous pace of moving the containers off the vessels and through the ports. And the unions representing those working there would like more defined safety procedures, less hurry up demands from the consortium of companies that run this, and that has yet to be resolved.
So
That's at
some
the basis of
studies
this.
by industry groups, Laura, are saying there's loss of something like $2 billion a day in economic losses to the country if there is a full shutdown.
Right. This is a major thing. And I don't know if people have fully focused on this and what the threat there is. We're talking, I mean, people talk about, oh, we have so many imports from China. Well, what does that look like? That looks like huge ships coming to our coast filled with, and those containers are what you see riding on a truck. They essentially get transferred, a big, huge box from a ship onto a truck and then shipped all across this country. And, you know, we're talking about auto parts, clothing, appliances, toys, computer parts. I mean, everything that you can think of, really. So, you know, this is a major
And
issue.
we're likely to see prices go up if, in fact, they don't resolve this pretty quickly.
Well, absolutely. As Major pointed out, 12.5% of the gross national product, that's a significant chunk. I would say, the thing that I'm always struck when I see these stories, and I will admit, for knowing I was coming on, I was unaware of the story, Diane, so I read up on it last night. The thing I'm always struck by is the interconnectivity of the economy, both domestically and internationally, and the fragility of it. You know, I think the economy is roaring back to life. Yeah. Well, this is I don't want to say it's a minor labor dispute, but it's a labor dispute. These are not uncommon. It's a labor dispute over, are you slowing down? Are you not? Safety, pay, et cetera, et cetera. This is not a new thing. And yet, an economy that does appear to sort of be moving, this is a thing that a self-inflicted wound that we can commit to it.
And I'm glad we can help to expand.
You always make me smarter.
I always say does nothing but expand my range of knowledge.
I always say it's like taking a quiz in school. It makes me
more like taking a midterm exam.
John Dickerson once said that he was scared to death I'd call on him and he wouldn't know what the subject was. So
all panelists on this show are a little bit scared of you, Diane.
Okay,
here is a healthy emotion.
That's fine. Okay, let's talk about what's happening in journalism, and let's start with Brian Williams. He has been now suspended. He's going to take 6 months of leave without pay. What's your reaction, Major? What's his future?
Well, Diane, as you might well imagine, this is a delicate bit of terrain for me.
You
CBS
bet.
Evening News is a direct competitor with the NBC Nightly News broadcast, so I cannot in any way speak for my company or speak for our broadcast about this, just because it's not proper for me to do that. What I will say is I consider it a tragic event for the evening news broadcast generally, how it happens, how its relationship with the audience in our country, its centrality to the degree that it still has centrality. Clearly it doesn't have the dominance or the near dominance it possessed when I was growing up and admiring everyone who sat in the anchor chair, because I watched evening news every night as a young boy.
Me too.
Desiring someday to enter this business. And I will tell you this, I've worked with Brian Williams on one particular story. When I was at National Journal, we were co-sponsors with NBC News of a Republican debate in Florida. So I had the great opportunity of working with Chuck Todd and Brian on the questions for that. And he was excellent in every way. He was on top of everything politically. He was wise and judicious about how to put together questions, how to run a debate. He was collegial and open, and in every way what I hoped someone in his lofty perch, who had no reason to pay any attention to this guy from National Journal, and he did, and he was collaborative and as good as I could have asked for.
Okay, and there's also the death of David Carr last night of the New York Times at age 58, apparently, of a heart attack, he wrote recently about the Brian Williams situation, Laura.
He did. David Carr was a brilliant, truly a brilliant writer, brilliant journalist. He had a media column in the New York Times every Monday, which I know I always was one of the first things I looked for in the paper on Mondays. And it is interesting how these stories come together, because he did write about Brian Williams this week. And I think what he wrote says a lot about both David Carr's insightfulness and also about Brian Williams' situation. What he said was, we want our anchors to be both good at reading the news and also pretending to be in the middle of it. He went on to talk about how when there's any sort of a tragedy, whether it be by Mother Nature or otherwise, the whole broadcast operation ships off and lands there, and with the anchor there right in the middle, trying to essentially, show the flag. And he says, we want our anchors to be everywhere, to be impossibly famous, globetrotting, hilarious, down to earth, and above all, trustworthy. It's a job description that no one can match.
And you also had the death of Bob Simon, just an extraordinary journalist on 60 Minutes, in a limousine in the back of a limo that somehow went out of control.
Yeah. The Bob Simon one, in some ways, is so difficult, I think, because this is someone, unlike me, who mostly spends my time in the undangerous places of, largely undangerous places of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. This is someone who put himself willingly into, Major and I were talking about this, any number of war zones, dangerous situations,
and was held prisoner at one point.
Right, and yet is sort of in the middle of Manhattan and passes away suddenly. I would say in general, it's a tough week for journalism. I don't want to be too navel gazing, but a tough week for journalism in that losing two people permanently in Bob Simon and David Carr, who I think everyone, whether you knew them or didn't, and I didn't know either of them, you would say these are the kind of people that we're proud to be in the same profession as, not covering the same things that we all necessarily cover, but doing it in the right way. It's hard to lose those people because it's not a plug and play. You don't just go find another Bob Simon. You don't just go find another David Carr.
And you're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Did you know Bob Simon, Major?
I did not have the privilege of knowing Bob. I only knew him by reputation. I knew him by the gold standard he set and hoped that my career someday would amount to one fraction of what his amounted to. But I can tell you within the CBS family, and it's a large and deeply tight-knit family, it is a devastating occurrence.
Yes, I can only imagine. The latest on Brian Williams is that he claimed to have been embedded with SEAL Team 6. And SEAL Team 6, what the SEAL team leaders are saying is no journalist is embedded with SEAL teams.
And in fact, he was not. And he had been told evidently on many occasions to stop exaggerating, really lying about his role in this situation. I don't know why he felt the need to, make what is already a fantastic career and being in places where most of us will never be, to try to make it just that much sexier, that much more danger filled. And yes, so he was finally called out. And what some of the reporting says is that the final strike was while he had told this story in, say, a Letterman interview before. This time he brought it to the nightly news broadcast. He featured himself at a ice hockey event where he with some veterans where this came up now, which kind of raises the question, why is he putting himself on the news to start with? I would say, but even putting that aside, he then brought what was essentially a fabrication to the news, and that's that's not acceptable. I mean, I think this idea that news people are supposed to be celebrities who are out there on Saturday Night Live and Jimmy Fallon, and in fact one time I saw him on Jimmy Fallon doing slow jamming the news on an issue I happen to know a lot about, which was immigration reform, and there were 3 factual errors in what Brian Williams came out of his mouth in one sentence, 3 factual errors about the president's executive action on immigration. And I thought at the time, well, this is odd from a news guy. You'd think he would have checked this or he would have known this. So I think there was a lot of entertainment going on. And maybe he lost touch with the news part.
That's an interesting point.
I've only tried to do one thing rigorously in my life in television, and that's never to be part of the story, ever. And I think it's a fundamental rule, it's a fundamental responsibility, and it's one wisely adhered to.
And it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward. Major Garrett, Chris Eliza, Laura Meckler, thank you all. Happy Valentine's.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you. And thanks for listening all. I'm Diane Rehm.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Danielle Knight,